If you had told anyone in 1982 that Michael Jackson, the man who just gave the world Thriller, who commanded the stage like no other, who seemed untouchable in his golden throne, if you had told them this same man would one day stand in Harlem calling his record label executives devils and racists, they would have thought you'd lost your mind. But 20 years later, there he was.
I prefer to perform than talk.
Yeah! July 6th, 2002. Before hundreds of supporters at Al Sharpton's headquarters, the King of Pop stepped to the microphone, not to perform, but to confront. He was declaring war on the very industry that made him. This isn't just another story about a fallen star or a difficult artist. This is about something far more profound. The moment Michael Jackson realized he was the latest victim in a century-old pattern of exploitation, and decided he would rather lose everything than stay silent. The revolution he started would cost him his fortune, his reputation, perhaps even his life. But first, to understand why the world's biggest entertainer felt he had no choice but to burn it all down, we need to understand what he inherited. Michael Jackson grew up surrounded by ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, though he'd claim those too visited him. These were the ghosts of black musicians who created the American soundtrack but died with empty pockets. Robert Johnson, who gave birth to the blues and disappeared at 27. James Brown, the godfather of soul, who worked relentlessly on the road for decades just to keep the lights on. Sammy Davis Jr., part of the Rat Pack, beloved by millions, yet scrambling for money until his final days. Jackson knew their stories intimately. These weren't just musical influences, they were warnings. He called them his pioneers, the ones who inspired me. But inspiration came with a darker education. He saw how the industry worked. Black artists would create the music. White-owned labels would own the music. And when the royalty checks came, somehow there was never enough left for the creators. By 2002, critics were calling this system what it was. One commentator described black music as a colonized nation, a cheap source of labor. Record companies had perfected a formula over decades. They'd find talent in black communities, sign them to contracts that seemed generous at first glance, then slowly reveal the trap. Production costs, promotion costs, tour support, all charged back to the artist. The more successful you became, the more you owed. Al Sharpton would stand at a podium that June and call these arrangements what they felt like to him: modern-day servitude. He spoke of indentured servant-type contracts where artists could sell millions of records and still owe their labels money, where performers kept touring just to stay solvent. The coalition he was launching with attorney Johnny Cochran used that language deliberately, not for shock value. They argued that record companies had turned creative freedom into lifelong debt. To them, the exploitation of black artists had evolved, not disappeared, from the plantation to the recording studio. Jackson watched his heroes die broke or broken. He studied their contracts, their mistakes, their regrets. He thought he could be different. He thought Thriller would make him untouchable. But by the time Invincible came out in 2001, he was learning a truth that every black superstar before him had learned. The house always wins, and the house had been winning for over a century. Invincible should have been Michael Jackson's victory lap. $30 million in production, years of perfectionist crafting. Released in October 2001, it shot to #1 in multiple countries. The King of Pop had returned after a 6-year absence with new music.
I have to ask you, how does it feel to have the #1 album in every country, worldwide, again?
It's a great honor. I'm very happy about it. We worked very hard on it, and I'm blessed that the fans accepted it the way they did, and I'm very honored. I really am. I don't take anything for granted.
Except something strange happened. Or rather, didn't happen. Where were the music videos? Where was the promotion? Where was Sony? The album that reportedly cost around $30 million to make was treated like an afterthought. Critics even joked it was Invincible, a cruel nickname for an album that seemed to vanish as soon as it arrived. Jackson watched in disbelief as his latest work moved roughly 6 to 8 million copies worldwide. For anyone else, that would be success. For the man who sold tens of millions with Thriller, it felt like sabotage. Sony offered its own explanation. Jackson, they said, refused to tour in the United States to back the album. No tour, no major promo budget, simple economics. But Jackson told a very different story. In late 2001, he told reporters he'd had touring and promotional plans, which they tried to destroy by failing to promote it. Two versions of reality, millions of dollars apart. Behind the scenes, the tension was deeper. Executives whispered that Jackson owed the label hundreds of millions in advances, recording and promotion costs that had piled up over the years. Jackson called those figures outrageous and offensive. Whatever the number, Sony held the balance sheet, and that leverage shaped every conversation. The tragedy of Invincible ran deeper than its numbers. That shortfall carried real weight inside the accounting maze of the music business. Every unsold copy added to the red ink. Every shelved single became another expense charged to his account. The album built to prove his freedom quietly tightened the financial noose. Even his 9/11 charity single, "What More Can I Give?" became a casualty.
Say the words, I'll let me go.
Disputes over release plans and rights kept it from an official rollout. Proof, he believed, of bad faith. The company that had stood with him through Thriller now looked to him like an adversary. Whether through mismanagement or design, the result felt the same. Michael Jackson was being erased from the pop landscape by the very empire that once crowned him. June 2002 arrived with the weight of decision. Michael Jackson had spent months watching his career being managed into irrelevance. His contract with Sony was ending, and he'd already told reporters in London 2 weeks earlier that he planned to leave as soon as he finishes his contract. But leaving wasn't enough. He wanted to make sure no other artist would face what he was facing. That's when Johnny Cochran entered the picture, the lawyer who had defended O.J. Simpson, who understood media spectacle and racial politics better than perhaps anyone in America. Alongside him stood Al Sharpton, the civil rights firebrand who never met a microphone he didn't like. Together, they were forming an initiative under the National Action Network to fight for artists' rights and accountability in record label practices.
And I made billions of dollars for Sony. And what they did was really terrible. And not just to me, but some of their other artists too. You know, from George Michael to Mariah Carey to, you know, yeah. We must put an end to this racism. Racism is bad. Tommy Mottola made some very racist remarks.
The coalition's goals were ambitious. They wanted to break up the indentured servant-type arrangements that kept artists in perpetual debt. They wanted transparency in accounting. They wanted artists to own their own work. But they had a problem. Most of the artists willing to speak out were white. Don Henley, Sheryl Crow, the Dixie Chicks, Billy Joel, rock and country stars who had their own battles with labels but didn't carry the racial weight of the argument. Then Jackson called. Entertainment Weekly noted the significance immediately. Jackson's participation would mark the first entry by a high-profile African-American or R&B artist into this battle.
Publicity stunts in Hollywood never surprised me. I'm not from Hollywood.
Suddenly, the movement had the biggest star in the world. More importantly, they had a black artist willing to say what others wouldn't. At the New York press conference, Jackson's statement was measured but clear. Record companies have to start treating their artists with respect, honor, and financial justice. I am proud to join this coalition, which represents all artists. But Sharpton went further. He stood at that podium and used the word that made record executives squirm: slavery. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was Michael Jackson, who had generated billions in revenue, who lived in a place called Neverland, who owned half the Beatles' catalog. And even he was saying the system was rigged. If it could happen to the king of pop, what chance did anyone else have? The Dixie Chicks had just settled their own dispute with Sony that same month. Other artists were watching, waiting. But when Jackson looked around that room for other black superstars to stand with him, he found himself remarkably alone. Where were the others? Where were the contemporary R&B stars, the hip-hop moguls who surely faced similar exploitation? The silence from his peers was deafening. And perhaps that's when Jackson realized just how dangerous his position was. He wasn't just challenging a company. He was challenging a system that had made very clear, over decades of destroyed careers, what happened to those who spoke up. To understand Michael Jackson's desperation by 2002, you need to understand what he'd risked. The Beatles' catalog, his smartest investment, his safety net, half of the most valuable song publishing in history, was no longer completely in his hands. He'd done something unprecedented for a superstar. He had used his stake in Sony ATV Music Publishing, which included the Beatles catalog, as collateral for massive loans. These loans, initially through Bank of America, later taken over by Fortress Investment Group, kept his empire afloat, but left his greatest asset tied to his debt. Sony, as his joint venture partner in the catalog, didn't own his share outright, but they had options and leverage that gave them enormous power over him. The financial architecture around Jackson was a masterpiece of complexity. Every album came with production costs, music videos, and worldwide marketing, expenses all recouped directly from his artist royalties. The bigger the spectacle, the bigger the debt. Even Thriller, the best-selling album of all time, was part of that paradox. Everyone made money, except in the end, the artist who made it possible. Every contract revision, every clause, was designed to keep the label's investment secure and the artist dependent. Sony's executives argued publicly that Jackson had run up hundreds of millions in recording and promotion advances, while Jackson's camp called that framing outrageous and offensive. Both were technically true in different ways. Jackson had borrowed heavily to sustain his business and lifestyle, and the recoupment terms meant that Sony always collected first. By the early 2000s, his financial freedom existed only on paper. The supposed reversion of his master recordings, the moment he might have gained full control of his music, was still years away. For Jackson, that was the breaking point. He had spent decades believing that superstardom would eventually buy him ownership, only to realize that success had been engineered to work against him. The system was elegant in its cruelty. The more he produced, the more debt he carried. The more hits he made, the tighter the contracts became. Sony had the rights to distribute his music, the option to acquire more of his publishing, and the legal right to call in his loans if he defaulted. They were his creditor, partner, and gatekeeper all at once. The illusion of independence was part of the design, freedom that looked like power, but wasn't. Other artists had suffered similar fates, but none on his scale. The Dixie Chicks had just escaped a bitter royalties dispute with Sony, but they didn't have a billion-dollar catalog at stake. Jackson did, and he was willing to risk it all. Whether that decision was brave or self-destructive depends on where you stand. What's undeniable is that he was the only one at his level willing to publicly call out the machine that made him. July 6, 2002, the National Action Network headquarters in Harlem. About 350 people packed the room, the air thick with anticipation. Michael Jackson, the man who usually spoke through melody, was about to use his voice as a weapon. He stood before them, no moonwalk, no glittering glove, just anger sharpened by years of frustration. "The record companies really do conspire against the artists," he began. "They steal, they cheat." Then came the words that electrified the crowd and the industry alike, especially against the black artists. Jackson wasn't dealing in abstractions anymore. He named names. The most powerful of them belonged to Tommy Mottola, chairman and CEO of Sony Music Entertainment, the executive who'd presided over Jackson's most profitable years. "Tommy Mottola is mean," Jackson said. "He's a racist and very, very, very devilish. He claimed that Mottola had used a racial slur toward another black executive, an allegation Mottola flatly denied through Sony's press office. There was nothing private about it. The world's biggest pop star stood before microphones and cameras, calling one of the most powerful men in entertainment a devil and a racist. But Jackson's speech wasn't only about Mottola. He invoked the lineage of black performers who came before him. James Brown, the godfather of soul, who'd spent decades touring to pay debts. Sammy Davis Jr., adored worldwide but burdened by financial woes. And other pioneers who built America's soundtrack without owning any part of it. To Jackson, these were not just heroes, but warnings. "When you fight for me," he told the crowd, "you're fighting for all black people, dead and alive." The crowd erupted. Longtime fans, civil rights activists, and members of the media witnessed a rare fusion of celebrity and protest. For a moment, the King of Pop was not an entertainer, but a whistleblower inside an industry few dared to challenge. And with those words, he crossed a line that no superstar before him had ever publicly crossed. Sony's response came fast and sharp. Within hours, a spokesman dismissed Jackson's accusations as ludicrous, spiteful, and hurtful, insisting that Tommy Mottola had championed Jackson's career. The statement was corporate, but coldly clear. The King of Pop had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The media reaction fractured instantly. Billboard described Sony as bewildered by the outburst, while the Los Angeles Times quoted executives suggesting Jackson was using race as a shield for disappointing Invincible sales. Others went further, calling it the race card, claiming he was spiraling under pressure. But on the streets, something else was brewing. To Jackson's supporters, the moment felt less like a breakdown and more like a rebellion. Within days, hundreds of fans rallied outside Sony's Manhattan offices, carrying placards portraying Mottola as the devil. They called for boycotts, blasted Jackson's songs through loudspeakers, and demanded fairness for artists. Across the Atlantic, UK fans mirrored the protests outside Sony's London studios, turning Jackson's accusation into an international headline. The images of him atop a red double-decker bus, umbrella in hand, flashing peace signs as crowds chanted below, became instant iconography. "When you fight for me," he shouted from that bus, "you're fighting for all black people, dead and alive." Industry voices treaded carefully. Some quietly admitted that Jackson had a point about systemic exploitation, but recoiled from his method of delivery. Artists like the Dixie Chicks and Don Henley, both engaged in their own label disputes that same year, stayed silent. Even allies in the broader artists' rights movement, like Sharpton's coalition, toned down their rhetoric in the aftermath. Everyone understood that Jackson hadn't just attacked a company, he'd detonated a bomb under the industry's public image. Behind closed doors, Sony decided not to fight it publicly any further. They confirmed he was free to leave when his contract expired, declining to extend or renegotiate. In corporate terms, they let the world's most successful entertainer walk away. But inside the business, everyone knew what that really meant. The bridge was burned. The machine had closed its ranks. And for the first time in his career, Michael Jackson stood completely alone. Michael Jackson got what he wanted. Sony let him walk away. No more contracts, no more obligations to the label that had defined his adult career. He was finally free. Except freedom, it turned out, came with a price tag he couldn't afford. By 2003, Sony released Number Ones, a greatest hits collection, without Jackson's input or enthusiasm. It was the last gesture of a dead relationship, the label squeezing final profits from the catalog they still controlled. Jackson never released another studio album on a major label for the rest of his life. The financial collapse came faster than anyone expected. By 2006, just 4 years after his Harlem speech, Jackson was drowning in $270 million of debt. The Bahrain deal he'd signed with 2C's Records, supposedly his fresh start, fizzled into nothing. Neverland Ranch, his sanctuary, had to be sold. The man who once outbid Paul McCartney couldn't afford his own home. The Beatles catalog he'd put up as collateral remained in limbo, Sony holding that option like a patient predator. Jackson scrambled for solutions. A new album with will.i.am that never materialized, various projects that died in planning stages. The industry had closed ranks. No major label would touch him. The revolution had been televised, and the revolutionary had lost. In 2007, in an ironic twist that Jackson must have found bitter, he partnered with Sony to acquire the famous music catalog. Even in his rebellion, he couldn't escape their orbit. He told one interviewer he had no regrets about his career, despite deliberate attempts to hurt me. The words rang hollow against the reality of his situation. When he died in 2009, Jackson was deep in rehearsals for This Is It.
Jackson has revealed the details of his comeback concerts in the UK.
Creative things. You want to take them places that you've never been before.
I'll be performing the songs my fans want to hear.
You want to show them talent like you've never seen before.
50 concerts at London's O2 Arena designed to generate the money he desperately needed. The comeback tour was really a survival tour. The King of Pop was going to dance his way out of debt, performance by performance. The exact fate he'd watched befall James Brown and Sammy Davis Jr. The final irony came in 2024, 15 years after Jackson's death. His estate sold half of his music catalog to Sony for $600 million, the highest price ever paid for a musician's work. The company he'd called evil, racist, devilish, now owned half of everything he'd created. They had won the long game. Yet something had changed because of Jackson's stand. Modern artists, particularly black artists, now demand ownership from day one. Chance the Rapper, Tyler the Creator, Beyoncé with Parkwood Entertainment. They built their own systems rather than trust the existing one. They learned from Jackson's battle, even if they learned that the price of fighting might be everything. Young artists now know to read the fine print about reversion clauses. They understand that production costs become chains. They recognize that the catalog is the real wealth, not the lifestyle. These weren't lessons Jackson taught through success. He taught them through spectacular public failure. Michael Jackson died 50 years old.
Very sad news, Jim Moret, and to all of our viewers. Both the Los Angeles Times and CBS News are both now reporting that Michael Jackson has died.
In all the world, and the Los Angeles Times and the Associated Press are reporting he was pronounced dead this afternoon.
$270 million in debt, preparing for concerts he didn't want to do, in a body broken by the stress of fighting a system designed to be unbeatable. He lost his fortune, his catalog eventually went to Sony, and the industry continued largely unchanged. By any conventional measure, his revolution failed. But revolutions aren't always measured by their immediate success. Sometimes they're measured by the conversations they start, the consciousness they raise, the paths they reveal even through their own destruction. Jackson forced the world to see what had been hidden in plain sight for a century, that the music industry was built on the systematic exploitation of black creativity. When Jackson stood in Harlem that day, calling Tommy Mottola a devil, his fury reached far beyond his own troubles. He carried the weight of every black artist who had built America's music while dying broke. He named names, broke ranks, and committed career suicide in public because somebody had to. The King of Pop decided that if his throne was built on exploitation, he'd rather burn it down than keep sitting on it. His estate's deal with Sony in 2024 might look like the ultimate defeat. The catalog he fought to protect, finally absorbed by the company he called evil. But that $600 million price tag tells a different story. It says black music has value. It says catalogs matter. It says ownership is worth fighting for, even if you lose. Every artist who maintains their masters, every creator who reads their contracts fine print, every musician who says no to a bad deal carries a piece of Jackson's rebellion with them. He showed them what happens when you fight the system directly. You lose everything. But he also showed them that there are worse things than losing everything. There's silence. There's complicity. There's watching the pattern repeat for another generation. Michael Jackson wanted to own his voice, literally and figuratively. The industry made sure he couldn't. But in trying to silence him, they amplified his message. The exploitation he exposed didn't end with his death, but neither did the resistance he inspired. Somewhere right now, a young black artist is reading a contract, remembering Jackson's story, and deciding to build their own empire rather than rent a room in someone else's. The King of Pop died in debt, rehearsing for concerts to pay bills that should never have existed. But he also died having said what needed to be said when the whole world was listening. He called the industry a plantation and its executives devils, and even if it cost him everything, he made sure we'd never be able to pretend we didn't know. It's neither victory nor defeat. It's something more complicated, more human, a superstar who chose truth over comfort, independence over security, and paid the price gladly. The system that destroyed Michael Jackson is still standing, but thanks to him, everyone can see its foundations are rotten. Sometimes that's all a revolution needs, to expose what was hidden, to ensure that the next fight starts from truth, not illusion. Jackson fought for all black artists, dead and alive, just like he promised. He lost that fight, but in losing, he exposed the battlefield. And that might be the most revolutionary thing the King of Pop ever did.